Hello, everyone. This is Sports Live Media with a video for today. The playoffs have been continuing in high school volleyball in the state of Alabama, and they have two regional places where it's going to go on. They got the South region, which is going to be held at the multiplex at the Crampton Bowl in Montgomery, and they have the North regional, which is going to be held at the Braun Center in Huntsville. So, without further ado, let's go over some of these pairings. Starting off with the South region, let's see. In Class 1A, you'll have Sweetwater versus Notasulga. You'll have Kinston versus Fruitdale, Faith Christian versus R.C. Hatch, Calhoun versus Brantley, Pleasant Home versus Central Hayneville, University Charter School versus Wadley, Milry versus Elba, Billingsley versus Southern Choctaw. In Class 2A, Pike Liberal Arts versus Francis Marion, Bayshore Christian versus J.U. Blacksher, Isabella versus Lynette, G.W. Long versus Geneva County, Wicksburg versus Ariton, Horseshoe Bend versus Fayetteville, Washington County versus Chickasaw, Tuscaloosa Academy versus Laverne. In Class 3A, Greensboro versus Tarrant, Mobile Christian versus Opp, Walter Wellborn versus Alabama Christian, Thomasville versus Ashford, Houston Academy versus Excel, Prattville Christian versus Randolph County, Strawn versus St. Luke's Episcopal, Indian Springs versus Sumter Central. In Class 4A for the South region, Montgomery Catholic versus Hale County, Orange Beach versus Andalusia, Munford versus Bibb County, Lamp versus Jackson, T.R. Miller versus Dallas County, Montevallo versus Talladega, Geneva versus UMS Wright, Sipsey Valley versus Trinity Presbyterian. In Class 5A for the South region, you have Beauregard versus Mulberry, Gulf Shores versus Providence Christian, Sylacauga versus Demopolis, Brubaker Tech versus Citronelle, Faith Academy versus Greenville, Montgomery Academy versus Jemison, Rehoboth versus Alberta, Elmore County versus Eufaula. In Class 6A for the South region, you have Calera versus Brookwood, Saraland versus Stanhope Elmore, Pelham versus Hillcrest Tuscaloosa, Pike Road versus Spanish Fort, Bayside Academy versus St. James, Northridge versus Briarwood Christian, Wetumpka versus Murphy, McAdory versus Chilton County. In Class 7A, for the South region, you have McGill-Tulane Catholic versus Dothan, Auburn versus Baker, St. Paul's Episcopal versus Central Phoenix City, Enterprise versus Fairhope. Now for the North Regionals, which will be at the Braun Center in Huntsville. In Class 1A, you'll have Addison versus Woodville, South Lamar versus Brilliant, Shoals Christian versus Hackleburg, Spring Garden versus Jefferson Christian, Summerton Christian versus Cedar Bluff, Belgreen versus Covenant Christian, Marion County versus Holy Spirit Catholic, Athens Bible versus Meek. In Class 2A, Sandrock versus Mars Hill Bible, Cornerstone versus Winston County, Eider versus Lindsay Lane Academy, Holly Pond versus Donahoe, Pleasant Valley versus Southeastern, Falkville versus Fife, Lamar County versus Altamont, Lexington versus West End. In Class 3A, Susan Moore versus Colbert Heights, Fayette County versus Glencoe, Lauderdale County versus Geraldine, Danville versus Piedmont, Ohatchee versus Vinemont, Plainview versus Clements, Westbrook Christian versus Carbon Hill, Phil Campbell versus Brindley Mountain. In Class 4A, you'll have Curry versus West Morgan, Corner versus Asheville, DAR versus Deschler, Good Hope versus White Plains, Jacksonville versus Aniana, Central Florence versus Madison County, Cherokee County versus Cordova, Priceville versus Hamilton. In Class 5A, you have Boaz versus Brewer, Ramsey versus Moody, Madison Academy versus Guntersville, Alexandria versus Hayden, Jasper versus Southside, Arab versus East Limestone, Springville versus Pleasant Grove, Lawrence County versus Douglas. In Class 6A, Fort Payne versus Athens, Homewood versus Huffman, Hazel Green versus Coleman, Mortimer Jordan versus Shades Valley, Mountain Brook versus Pinson Valley, Hartselle versus Buckhorn, Gardendale versus Parker, Muscle Shoals versus Oxford. In 7A, you have Spain Park versus James Clemens, Huntsville versus Hoover, Thompson versus Albertville, Bob Jones versus Oak Mountain. This is just the first round of the playoffs, and they will be taking place here next week. Anyway, those teams that made it to the playoffs, I wish them well, and I hope they do well and stuff. The top 4 from each region within each classification will advance to the state tournament, which will be held the following week in Birmingham. So anyway, that's that information, and I hope that you can do something with it, and I hope that all of y'all have a great day. Thank you.